Hello, and welcome to this short overview of the paper, The Effect of Hyperparameter Tuning on the Comparative Evaluation of Unsupervised Anomaly Detection Methods, which is work by me, Jonas Soene, and Elia van Wolputte, in collaboration with Lorenzo Perini, Vincent Verkruijsen, Wannes Meert, Jesse Davis, and Hendrik Blokeel. The problem we consider in this paper is that of hyperparameter selection when you're evaluating different anomaly detection algorithms. So in a standard benchmark setting, you have a set of algorithms A and a set of datasets D, and you ask yourself, how do algorithms A perform on dataset D? Given that anomaly detection is unsupervised, how do you actually select each algorithm's hyperparameters? And does your selection of these hyperparameters influence the results of your comparison? One way to select these hyperparameters, and which is often found in literature, is to use out-of-the-box performance, in which you assume that practitioners will do nothing and will just use the implementation defaults. This means that in your evaluation, you use default hyperparameters or recommendations that you can find in literature. However, we believe that it's unrealistic to assume this and believe that in practice, people will try to find good hyperparameters for their problem. And therefore, using out-of-the-box performance actually underestimates the potential of each algorithm, especially if the algorithm has influential hyperparameters. Second, using out-of-the-box performance is also ambiguous because it's not clear how these default parameters have been chosen. As such, they might have been optimized for a certain kind of dataset. Another way, and at the total different side of the spectrum, you have peak performance, which is also sometimes found in literature. With peak performance, you assume that the practitioner in some way or another can select optimal hyperparameters. And again, this is quite an unrealistic assumption, because these optimal hyperparameters might not be easy to find with just a limited amount of tuning. And therefore, peak performance actually overestimates the potential of an anomaly detection algorithm. Moreover, it's actually unsound because you're tuning on the test set. What we propose is actually to use tuned performance, in which we assume that practitioners do an honest effort to select good hyperparameters. And this honest effort is more realistic than assuming practitioners do nothing, or to assume that practitioners can somehow find optimal hyperparameters. The methodology that we suggest later is also reproducible, fair, and sound. So, what is this honest effort? The honest effort to select good hyperparameters, we interpret that as tuning them using a validation set, which is realistic because in practice you could do exactly the same. The practitioners just label some anomalies, label some normal data, and use that small validation set to tune the hyperparameters. The methodology that we then can use is we train the anomaly detectors with multiple hyperparameter settings, still unsupervised, so with all the unlabeled data. Then we select a detector with the best performance on a small labeled validation set. So that's the hyperparameter tuning itself. And then in the end, we evaluate the selected detector based on the remainder of the labeled data, so the labeled test set. So let's see how out-of-the-box and peak performance compare for several popular anomaly detectors. As you can see, we recorded the average AUC for out-of-the-box performance and for peak performance over a big collection of standard benchmark datasets. And as you can see, the influence of hyperparameters differs from algorithm to algorithm. One class SVM and LOF are the hyperparameters are quite influential, while for KNN and Habos the effect is way less. However, the difference is big enough to actually influence the results you would make from comparing the algorithms. So using out-of-the-box performance, KNN actually is second in line in the ranking. And when using peak performance, it descends until second to last in the ranking. For one class SVM, it's actually the inverse. One class SVM is last in the ranking in out-of-the-box performance, but when you consider peak performance, it's third in line. So this hyperparameter selection actually influences the algorithm's ranking and therefore the conclusions of your study. So on this spectrum between out-of-the-box and peak performance, where does this tuned performance lie? For most algorithms, as you can see here, tuning helps. So we get better than default parameters because we outperform out-of-the-box performance, but we don't reach peak performance. Yeah, so with a little bit of tuning, you cannot find these optimal hyperparameters. However, and surprisingly, for others, tuning is actually counterproductive. So for one class SVM and CBLOF, you actually get parameters that are worse than the default parameters. We have an experiment in the paper that illustrates why this is the case, but intuitively what we see is that for one class SVM and CBLOF, your performance on the validation stat is still okay. It's just that the performance doesn't translate to performance on the test set. So what actually happens is these algorithms overfit on the validation set, and other algorithms don't have an issue with this. So in summary, we argue that this tuned performance is a realistic way to measure performance, and that contrary to out-of-the-box performance and peak performance, it's actually a reproducible, fair, and sound way to compare algorithms. For more details and more experiments, we recommend that you read the full paper.